Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Margaret Perrow from Southern Oregon University, and I'm talking today about how a particular South African non-government organization, or NGO, might help us think differently about the multidimensional influence of institutions. The Joint Enrichment Project, or JEP, as I am going to call it, was an NGO that was prominent in South African youth development from 1986 to 2008. And it was one of many institutions that played a key role in bringing South Africa out of apartheid and into the global economy in the 1990s. Now, NGOs that attempted to partner with the South African government, the new government, after the 1994 transition to democracy faced many challenges, including a new bureaucracy of development in the context of the country's neoliberal economic framework, which extended principles of market capitalism into the development world. These challenges eventually led to many NGOs' closure, including the closure of JEP in 2008. Development researchers are often critical of NGOs like JEP, arguing that they contribute only marginally to socioeconomic change because they're generally unable to scale up. While on the surface, JEP's story might confirm this criticism, its hidden institutional history challenges it as a way to assess an institution's impact, I think. To fully understand the effectiveness of an NGO, both its intended and its unintended impacts must be considered. But exactly how an institution's influence is spread, its impact on socioeconomic change, and its impact on individual lives over time typically remain hidden. This paper draws on over 20 years of research grounded in history, ethnography, and applied linguistics to explore those impacts. The lens that I'm using here is influence rather than effectiveness. And I do want to mention that my recent book, A Hidden History of Youth Development in South Africa, explores these ideas more fully. So this is a bit of an overview of what I mean by this idea of influence. I find it helpful to think of the lens of influence as kind of a prism. A significant part of the impact of this particular NGO is its long-term impact on the public discourse about youth and on policies and practices of youth development in South Africa. But I include here the life trajectories of JEP's constituents, directors, staff, and participants as a critical part of the institution's history that also reveal a concrete, kind of intimate version of a bigger social story. Decades of anti-apartheid struggle, transition to democracy, subsequent socioeconomic changes, and socioeconomic reproduction significantly. Considering the NGO as a prism puts this bigger story into human terms, refracting layers of socioeconomic change and reproduction in post-apartheid South Africa. So my crude little diagram here shows the Joint Enrichment Project as the institution with the light being refracted out in various beams corresponding to those lines on the right of your screen there. And we'll come back to those in a little bit. First of all, a bit of context about South Africa. If you're old enough, you probably remember the 1994 elections. When I began my research into youth development in 1998, the newly democratic South Africa still largely had faith in the African National Congress, which was Nelson Mandela's party, the ANC, and their slogan of a better life for all. And when the 1994 elections rolled around, there was a great optimism that things would dramatically improve for the Black majority population, most of whom lived in relative poverty in urban townships or so-called homelands in rural areas. In 1990, Mandela was released from 27 years in prison. And that was just 4 years before the election, in which he, of course, was elected president. And that's him on the right casting his ballot, and the long lines of people queuing up to cast their ballots in the lower left, many of them, of course, in support of Mandela for president. So what's happened since then in South Africa? Socioeconomic changes and reproduction. 25 years after apartheid's end, South Africa is still a vastly unequal country. I borrow this graph from the World Bank report 2018. There are many more graphs there that illustrate sort of the changes and lack of changes in South Africa over the 20 years. But basically, more than 2 decades after the elections, racialized inequities persist in South Africa. Political freedom did not translate into positive socioeconomic changes for those living in the townships, which are still basically racially segregated and typically underdeveloped urban areas that are located outside cities and towns. The 2018 World Bank report identified South Africa as the most unequal country in the world, according to the Gini coefficient that measures the gap between wealth and poor and who owns the wealth. In South Africa, the overall population has steadily been growing. Today, there are over 60 million South Africans. But despite a rise in the so-called Black middle class and increases in social welfare grants, as the population has continued to rise, the sheer number of people living in poverty has also grown, and the wealth gap is persistent. Previous disadvantage has by and large rolled into present disadvantage in terms of education, skills, unemployment, and poverty. Access to basic services has improved slightly. So more people have access to water, electricity, and sanitation services. However, more than half of South Africans live in poverty, as defined by less than approximately $83 a month, and more than 25% live below what the World Bank calls food poverty line, which is $37 a month. And Black South Africans, approximately 80% of the population, have the highest rates of poverty, significantly higher than the white minority, the colored, and the Indian minorities. And the last significant thing here is that poverty directly correlates with education level. Poverty consistently decreases as education level rises. Since 1998, I've returned to South Africa multiple times to follow changes in the lives of a group of people I came to know well as young adults in 1998, when they were staff and participants at the Joint Enrichment Project, JEP, in Johannesburg. So I want to fast forward to 2018 and introduce you to Philemon, who was one of those participants back in 1998. I first met him then when he was in his 20s. He had joined an employment skills project for young adults at JEP, where I was a visiting researcher. 20 years later, in 2018, Philemon and the other former participants were all in their 40s or 50s. And that morning, I sat with Philemon on an upturned plastic crate in the cement yard outside his mother's small cinder block house in Soweto, which is the sprawling conglomerate of townships outside Johannesburg that's home to over 2 million Black South Africans. Philemon thought back to the 80s and 90s, and this is what he said. There was the struggle and the elections, but did we or didn't we achieve freedom? We sipped our orange Fantas and pondered this question in light of his life circumstances. Despite his hopes and dreams and his participation in JEP 20 years ago, Philemon was still unemployed. He had a monthly child support grant of about US $30, which was not enough to feed his family or pay rent on the one-room shack where he lived with his wife and his young daughter, let alone pay for the school fees. He had been on the waiting list for a government house since 1999. He went on to say this: we are still being oppressed, even though we gained democracy. Some people got rich, but it wasn't us. That comment sums up, in a sense, the socioeconomic changes and socioeconomic reproduction, or lack of changes, in the past two decades. South Africa is still vastly unequal, and still unequal largely along racial lines, despite a growing number of middle-class and wealthy Black Africans, which does exist. In 1998, I arrived with an interest in South Africa, with an interest in alternative education institutions. I wanted to know what learning in such programs meant to participants like Philemon, and what impact it had on their lives in the broader context of socioeconomic change in South Africa. I chose JEP to look at as an institution because it was an influential Johannesburg-based NGO, and one of the NGOs that played a vital role, as I said, in bringing South Africa out of apartheid and into the world economy in the 1990s. It was a great place for me to explore questions about learning in socio-political contexts that were undergoing transition and change. The JEP was founded by the South African Council of Churches and the South African Catholic Bishops' Council at the height of the resistance era, with young anti-apartheid activists at its helm. This was the mid-1980s. It was both a sanctuary for youth who were affected by the violence of the struggle and a platform for its activist directors to shape policy and practices in South Africa. JEP was a pioneer in the field of youth development. It ran a wide range of pilot projects that they intended to have government take up after the elections, and it played a key role in the formation of national youth policy and discourse about youth in South Africa. And finally, it was highly visible as an institution to international donors, which helped keep the South African development world connected to the international development world. So it was a great place to look at the impact of alternative education institutions. Again, here's my prism, and I want to pull back a little bit, and I'll step back after tracing the history of this institution and following participants and staff for over more than 20 years. Here's what I can say. JEP did function as a sort of prism, refracting broader changes in post-apartheid South Africa, and these beams correspond to shifts in the landscape of youth development in discourse, policy, and practice primarily, okay? So discourse, moving the way youth were talked about in South Africa from a lost generation or young lions during the resistance movement to marginalized youth, which shifted the burden to structures of society and took it away from individuals, to a more contemporary view of youth as a resource. JEP was behind that discursive shift. In policy, JEP was behind convening multiple national youth conferences, the coalescing of an actual youth sector, and advocacy for youth development funding. And in practice, its pilot projects did become models for things like the National Youth Service in South Africa, for Youth Build South Africa, for Community Works program, and other current government programs. So that's three of the beams coming out of the Prism. It was also a touchstone for hundreds of participants, youth participants, who gained a strong sense of belonging and a connection to the broader changes taking place in South Africa. It was a stepping stone for them, but their lives were not socioeconomically transformed by their participation. And I'll show you that in just a minute. It was a catapult for former staff, propelling them into new positions of influence in youth development, or the development world more broadly, and somewhat uneasily into a middle or wealthy class lifestyle. And finally, it was a platform for a handful of directors, many of whom were already prominent anti-apartheid activists. It was a platform for them to exert agency in politics and government and development. Ultimately, though, while JEP made enormous lasting contributions to the youth development field, it also ironically functioned as a micro-engine of socioeconomic reproduction, reflecting broader patterns in post-apartheid South Africa. There were minimal socioeconomic changes for a majority, and a rapid and significant boost in socioeconomic status for a minority, in this case, the staff at the organization, who entered with more social capital in terms of education and employment experience to begin with. So I want to focus now on two of the streams of light coming out of that prism, the participants and the staff. In 1998, the JEP ran a program called the Youth Work Scheme. It was a 6-month program for young people ages 20 to 30. For the most part, they learned some hard skills like carpentry and tiling, and then they learned some soft skills, communication skills through personal development workshops. This group of 15 participants, as I said, was aged 20 to 30. And this is where I first got to know Philemon and the other 14 participants from Soweto that year. I had the privilege of working alongside them as they renovated a community center, participated in workshops, and made plans for their future. And they often said, "It's happening, Margaret," as they went through the program. By the time they'd completed the project, Philemon and the other 14 participants had experienced a significant shift psychologically and socially, from feeling stuck in between to feeling in transition in a rapidly transitioning country. "It's happening, Margaret," was the expression of that feeling of being in transition, and they looked forward to their future with a new sense of optimism and confidence. Here, 3 of them are Thabo, Lovely, and Isayesh in front of the Hector Peterson Memorial in Soweto in 1998. This is a memorial to the first young person who was killed in the 1976 student uprising. So how did this shift in their sense of themselves happen for them at JEP? When they joined, they felt in between in several ways. They felt in between historically because they were just slightly too young to have been leaders in the 1976 uprising, and too old to have benefited from changes that were currently taking place in education. So Christopher's quote illustrates that. He knew well about Hector Peterson. That's one of the people who made us to get freedom, but he was just 2 years old. So they felt historically a little bit in between some of the major changes happening in the country. Materially, they were not living in abject poverty, but they weren't wealthy either. They were pretty much in between in Soweto. They lived in small 4-room homes with an extended family. Most had indoor kitchen plumbing, but an outside outhouse. They were all unemployed, like the majority of young adults from the township. And so this is, my head's in the way of Ntutuko's quote, but he says, "This is life before JEP. I was sitting on the street watching people who are going to work, coming back. These are my friends. They have no jobs." So sort of an expression of that feeling of in-betweenness. And discursively, they found themselves in between traditional, collective, hierarchical discourses and emerging calls for things like student-centered learning and raising one's individual voice in a competitive market economy that really favored individuation and competition, and that reflected this broader neoliberal economic context, right, of globalization. Participating in discourse practices at the NGO, which was itself engaged in these broader discourses of development and a competitive market economy, led to a significant shift in the participant's sense of self. The quote here is from Lovely, who talks about the discourse in school, which was very hierarchical, top down, talk by the teachers. And now they were being asked to raise their own individual voices, which was a significant, sometimes a conflict in discourses for them. So I started looking at repositioning episodes, as I came to call them, highly reflexive moments on the worksite or in workshops where discourse or conversation became about the immediate context, about relationships, or about the discourse itself, and hence about identity. Resistance discourse, traditional school discourse, family and home, gendered discourse often clashed with the Western development discourse and with new ways of talking about individual rights and the importance of individual voices being heard. And my book actually takes you into these repositioning moments deeply to see the discourse in action and better understand the impact of the NGO on individuals' sense of identity. But the important thing to know is that in navigating these entangled and often contradictory discourses, participants reposition themselves in relation to the group and to broader society, leading to a sense of self in transition. So now fast forward to 2018. I had returned multiple times over the years, most recently in 2018. I was curious to know what practical long-term difference this shift might make in their lives. How had their lives changed, and how had the shift to an in-transition identity played out for participants 20 years later? There they are in the 1998, three of them in front of the Hector Peterson Memorial, and the same three in 2018. Those are the color photos there. By now, the former work scheme participants had children of their own mostly. They had experienced incremental positive material changes in their lives. Most were employed in some way, informally or formally. They all lived on paved streets. Most had indoor toilets. Two had bought their own four-room homes, little houses in Soweto. One had received a government house, a one-room government house. Two actually owned cars, but they couldn't afford to repair them or to buy the gas. And here's a few more of those participants in 2018, some of them with their children. They expressed disappointment nonetheless that change had come so slowly, that their lives in 2018 were not as different from 1998 as they had hoped. Many had returned to live with extended family in their childhood home where they were raising their own children. Employment was precarious. Money often ran out before the end of the month. The government had not delivered on the promises of 1994 in their view, and none had the means to reach the employment goals that they had articulated so clearly 2 decades earlier. They couldn't afford to send their children to formerly white schools in the suburbs, so their children mostly attended fee-free or low-fee schools in the townships, which are notoriously lower resourced. In some, they felt incremental or no change in socioeconomic status. Their experiences reflect the reality that widespread racialized inequities persist. So in the upper left, it's Lungile in front of, with her children in front of the little one-room house that she received from the government. Upper right is Thabo in front of the house that he recently purchased, the little four-room house. He has just lost his job after many years as a truck mechanic, unfortunately. On the lower left, Isaesh is selling Tupperware occasionally to make ends meet. She's moved back to live in the house she grew up in with her sisters and their children. Middle right is David, who runs a recycling business from his childhood home where he moved back to recently, where he's raising his daughter. He pushes his recyclables 8 kilometers each way on a handmade cart, and that's how he makes ends meet. And then lower right is Rebecca outside the childhood house where she grew up, where she still lives with her adult children, working as a daycare worker and hoping to someday still own her own daycare center. So this is the uncomfortable finding then, that discourse practices at the NGO in late 1990s South Africa profoundly and enduringly affected participants' self-identities, but not their life trajectories. For participants, socioeconomically, the institution was a stepping stone, but it was not transformative for them. Arguably, they are where they would have been without the NGO in terms of employment, income generation, living circumstances, given their education and family resources to begin with. But it was a touchstone. 20 years later, they look back and they recall it with nostalgia. Socially, emotionally, and in terms of their identity, it was a touchstone. I did that, representing agency, looking at something that they had done. I can do that. The self-confidence continues. My team, a sense of belonging. They still recalled and felt that sense, that connection to something bigger that defined their time at JEP. But socioeconomically, they had gone back to feeling in between. Their exuberant sense of being in transition was gone. They shared a sense that change was too slow and disillusionment with government. But what about former staff? Now, this is where things start to get interesting and I think problematic for social justice NGOs, institutions that seek to be transformative forces in development. There were actually few differences between staff and participants demographically. They were the same age, they were the same racially, from the same racial demographics, from the same neighborhoods in some cases, but significantly they had different educational opportunities. The staff had basically more education coming into JEP as staff. And for them, the NGO served as an incubator. It incubated their skills, it gave them more social capital and a greater sense of agency, and then it served as a launching pad socioeconomically and professionally. It moved them, and in some cases it propelled them into positions of influence in the development realm, into lives of relative wealth and privilege. And this slide depicts some of those folks today. The income insecurity and in-betweenness of the former participants' lives was largely reproduced over time, while former staff, and here you see some of them, were launched somewhat ambivalently into the new middle class, what's often called the new Black middle class. In this respect, participants and staff together represent a microcosm of broader scale socioeconomic patterns. The former staff are sought after consultants. They have high-level government positions. They lead innovative youth development projects. All of them have moved out of the townships, at least all that were part of this particular project. All of them have moved out of the townships. They own gated homes or estates in the formerly white suburbs. Their children all attend private schools. They have a strong sense of agency and purpose, which they universally attribute to their formative learning at JEP. But is this a success story? They don't think so. They have personally benefited from South Africa's post-apartheid accomplishments, but they still live in a country struggling to achieve economic growth, with unemployment still officially just under 30% and a youth unemployment rate well over 50%. As development professionals, they express ambivalence about this, a sense of frustration that the country has not yet seen the kind of transformation they hoped for 20 years ago. And they regret that JEP as an institution didn't have the broad transformative impact that they imagined at the time. Couple quotes, Seppo, who currently works for the city of Johannesburg doing youth programming, says, "For me, there is anger. You're telling me this is freedom, but actually it's free for some, not for all of us." And so we return to Philemon's comments from the beginning. Did we get freedom or didn't we? Kahiso, in the second quote, heads Youth Build South Africa. He talked to me about what he called his fairly decent lifestyle, but he grimaced while he was talking about it. He didn't want his kids to struggle the way he had as a child. Hence the private schools, the electronics, the Uber accounts. But he said, there's stuff I don't like about it. It can create kids who are disconnected. I'm a community developer. We are so busy trying to create a future for them that our kids are disconnected from what we do as development practitioners. That troubles me. The challenge for them as parents who are social justice activists is clear. They appreciate their relatively affluent material circumstances and their children's promising futures, yet they deeply regret that the dream they had worked toward at JEP, the integration of young people into the economy, helping them achieve a significantly better future, has manifested for them as individuals, but not on a large scale for youth in South Africa. There's a Kenyan activist, Ferozi Manji, whose theory about licensed freedoms and emancipatory freedoms helps provide shed a little light on the staff's feelings of ambivalence. Licensed freedoms are those gained within an existing system or framework. They change individuals' lives for the better, but they don't change the system or the overall dynamics of power. On the other hand, emancipatory freedoms affect the entire system, or even bring about a new order of things, right? Manji has criticized contemporary NGOs like JEP that work to help people gain license freedoms within a neoliberal economic framework. This, I think, helps explain some of the ambivalence and distress of former JEP staff who appreciated the transformation of their personal circumstances that the institution afforded them, but universally lament that these were licensed individual freedoms, that JEP's impact was not more broadly emancipatory. None of this is intended to minimize the institution's significant impact, but it's important to recognize the deeply entrenched and systemic nature of the inequality and the challenges that face social justice institutions that seek to be transformative forces. Okay, so just to sum up here, JEP's enduring influence. Again, some of these things I've mentioned briefly. The institution put the case of vulnerable youth on the map. It shifted discourse about youth to a more positive frame and advocated for coherent national youth policy and youth agencies. It coalesced a youth sector, providing a sort of ethos for the youth sector in South Africa, including a set of youth development principles and frameworks that inform youth work broadly today. It was a laboratory for youth programs. The Youth Work Scheme became a model for large-scale initiatives like the National Youth Service, Community Work Program, Youth Build South Africa, and so on. And as I've pointed out, it served as an incubator for staff. But there's a paradox. We might call it an irony or a dilemma even that Jep's story illuminates. A development institution can simultaneously do significant development work and reproduce inequalities that are reflected in the lived experiences of staff and participants. This creates an uncomfortable dissonance for former staff, especially if they're development workers whose own material circumstances are profoundly changed by their involvement in the institution. I like to think, though, that the influence of the organization actually includes that dissonance and that ambivalence that's felt and expressed by Jep's former staff. I think that dissonance itself may be a powerful force for social change. And so a few questionable conclusions. Significant institutional impacts are not always measurable in conventional ways or immediately discernible. So the shaping of identities, not just skills acquisition or building human capital to boost employment rates, can be enduring outcomes. But shifts in self-identity may or may not translate into shifts in life trajectories, because unless external structures shift radically, prior social capital, including education, is likely to play a more powerful role. The story of Jep shows that the significance of an institution includes the way it can act as a prism, telling refracted human stories of broader socioeconomic patterns. This prismatic effect might actually be seen as part of its influence. My book that I mentioned earlier, A Hidden History of Youth Development in South Africa, explores, I'll move myself up, there we go, explores the connections between institutional discourse, broader discourses, and young adults shifting identities in post-apartheid South Africa. Looking back, in fact, in putting together this paper, I've come to see that in a sense, this is what I hope my book ultimately does, to further the influence of an extraordinary institution by framing its story as a prism, and in the process, offer a different way of looking at NGOs. Thank you, and here you have my website, my email. I'd welcome contact and how you can access my book at Routledge. Thank you very much.